The reels that survive history are never the whole story. Somewhere in a storage room that no one labels anymore lie the other versions, the rough cuts, the dangerous takes, the scenes that made someone in an office decide we can't show that. In the late 80s and early 90s, action cinema was being cranked out so fast that the line between storytelling and damage control almost disappeared. Films were shot in jungles that were too real, on sets that shook with financial collapse, and around stars whose off-screen storms bled into every frame. Most audiences only saw what made it through the final cut, the explosions that tested well, the lines that sounded heroic, the endings that wouldn't scare investors. But between those polished moments were compromises, lost edits, and entire storylines, quietly buried in the name of safety image or simple survival. Some sequels were stitched together from chaos. Some war stories were filmed in places that felt too close to the real thing. Some martial arts sagas were sliced apart until the bones of the original vanished. Tonight, we're not looking at the posters or the trailers or the versions that played safe. We're stepping into the cutting room, into the doubt, the panic, and the choices that rewrote what these films were allowed to be. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1: Strike Commando, 2: 1988. There is a certain kind of sequel that feels less like a continuation and more like an emergency, something assembled because a studio needed a product, a market needed noise, or a filmmaker needed one more job to keep the lights on. Strike Commando 2 was all of these at once. Shot at breakneck speed in the Philippines under Bruno Mata's relentless schedule, it carried the illusion of a bigger, louder follow-up. But behind the lens lived a story far stranger than anything in the script. Production began with a problem. The star from the first film wasn't returning, and the new lead was cast only days before cameras rolled. Sets were repurposed from other movies, props were borrowed, and the crew often shot multiple scenes a day simply because daylight was running out. Jungle battle sequences were recreated in locations still scarred from real military conflict, and extras were recruited on the spot, sometimes without fully understanding what the film was. On the surface, audiences saw a simple action adventure, a soldier racing through the jungle, explosions rocking the horizon, and a storyline designed to echo the spirit of the first film. But the truth hid in the edit. Entire scenes were pulled from unrelated productions to save money, stitched together so seamlessly that only the most dedicated fans recognized the recycled shots. Dialogue was rewritten in post to match footage that didn't quite align. Even the pacing shifted dramatically between regions, with some international versions containing alternate cuts believed to be closer to Mate's original intention. The film that reached video shelves looked confident, almost swaggering, but its confidence was a mask. Beneath the surface was a patchwork, a survival act created under impossible conditions, revealing how a movie can be finished, not through vision, but through endurance. Film 2: Delta Force 3, The Killing Game, 1991. Some films are born from inspiration, others from necessity, and a rare few emerge from the rubble of a collapsing studio. Delta Force 3, The Killing Game, belonged entirely to the third category. By the time production began, Cannon Films, once a booming factory of action, cinema was on its final breath. Budgets had shrunk to shadows, schedules were carved into impossibly thin lines, and the people working on the film knew they were assembling something during the company's last days, when every decision felt like a scramble to outrun bankruptcy. The context behind the camera was far more dramatic than anything scripted. Directors changed, rewrites happened overnight, and the cast was adjusted repeatedly as contracts fell apart. Some sequences were planned as large-scale set pieces, only to be reduced to minimal locations and stunt work when funding disappeared mid-shoot. Even the crew admitted later that no one could say with certainty which version of the screenplay they were actually filming by the final week. On screen, audiences saw exactly what they expected from a Delta Force installment: special operatives, international threats, explosions cutting across dusty landscape. The marketing framed it as a natural continuation of the franchise, a bold new chapter, carrying the spirit of the earlier films. But beneath that surface lived the hidden truth: scenes stitched from incomplete material, action sequences truncated to hide missing coverage, and a final cut shaped more by what the production didn't have than by what it did. Rumors persist that entire subplots were filmed and then lost, casualties of rushed shipping and chaotic storage. Other moments appeared in international VHS releases, but vanished from you. Prints suggesting multiple edits were created simply to make sense of what remained. The film that survived wasn't the one originally imagined. It was the one that could be assembled before Canon Films fell silent for good. Film 3, Eye of the Eagle, 1987. There are action films that recreate war, and there are action films that seem to brush against the edges of something uncomfortably real. Eye of the Eagle belonged to a particular era when American and Filipino filmmakers joined forces to produce fast, explosive war movies shot not on controlled studio lots, but in dense jungles and forgotten clearings where echoes of real conflict still lingered in the air. Under Serio 8. Santiago's direction, the production moved with a sense of urgency that was part ambition, part survival. The context behind this film was shaped by opportunity and risk. Equipment was limited, locations were unpredictable, and weather could turn a full day's schedule into a single desperate take. Firearms were sometimes rented from local sources on short notice, and stories circulated among the crew about how certain explosions were far stronger than intended. Extras were often community members recruited, quickly given minimal direction, and sent running across fields as pyrotechnics detonated only meters away. On the surface, the movie delivered what audiences expected from a late 80s war thriller. Helicopter assault sweeps through enemy territory and soldiers navigating the chaos of Vietnam-era combat. It had the pacing, the grit, and the familiar tone that marked Santiago's long run of action cinema. But the hidden truth reveals how close the production came to capturing danger that wasn't entirely staged. Many scenes were filmed in areas still scattered with remnants of past fighting. Some stunt work relied on trust rather than rehearsals, simply because the production lacked the luxury of time. There were whispers that several early takes were kept not because they were perfect, but because no one wanted to repeat them. The final film feels rough, raw, and strangely alive. That energy wasn't a stylistic choice. It was the byproduct of a crew making a movie in places where reality pressed in from all sides. What emerged on screen was a war film that blurred the line between performance and presence, between cinema and the shadows of history. Film 4, American Samurai, 1992. Some films exist in two forms: the one audiences were allowed to see, and the one that nearly slipped through before someone decided it was too much. American Samurai became a perfect example of how a movie can fracture into parallel versions, not because of artistic reinvention, but because of fear pressure and the unpredictable pulse of early 90s action market. What began as a violent R-rated martial arts saga eventually emerged in multiple edits, each one carrying a different idea of what the film was supposed to be. The production itself was caught between identities. With Canon Films in its turbulent final phase, the crew worked under shifting conditions, unsure how much creative freedom they truly had. Mark Dacascos, early in his ascent, was pushed through intense training and demanding choreography, while stunt performers and fight coordinators built elaborate tournament sequences intended to showcase raw physicality and blade-to-blade combat. In those early cuts, the fights were longer, harsher, and more visceral, designed to echo the darker energy of late 80s martial arts cinema. But that vision didn't survive intact. The U.S. distributors, nervous about marketability and rating restrictions, sliced entire moments from the film. Some fights were shortened, others were rearranged in order. A handful of violent beats vanished completely, leaving gaps that sharp-eyed viewers later noticed. The international version, however, kept much of the original tone. It was rougher, bloodier, and closer to what the filmmakers intended, a parallel film that only certain regions ever experienced. On the surface, American Samurai presents itself as a simple tournament story, rivals honor blades crossing under hot light. Yet hidden beneath that clean narrative is the story of a film reshaped to fit conflicting expectations. The U.S. cut looks smoother but quieter, while the international cut reveals a rawness that suggests a very different ambition. And in the space between these two versions lies an uncomfortable truth: sometimes a movie isn't changed to improve it, but to tame it, so that the parts that once burned too brightly remain visible only in shadows. Film 5, The Peacekeeper, 1997. There are action films built on spectacle, and there are action films built on control, on protecting reputations, avoiding controversy, and shaping an image even when the production itself begins to bend under pressure. The Peacekeeper arrived at a moment when its star, Charlie Sheen, stood at the center of intense public scrutiny, and the film's creation became a careful dance between what the story demanded and what the marketing could safely reveal. Behind its explosions and military intrigue, a quieter, more complicated struggle unfolded in the editing room. The production began with Ambition, a mid-budget thriller mixing political tension with high-torque action sequences. But as filming progressed, the environment around the project shifted. Reports suggest that certain stunt setups were scaled back or reconfigured entirely after early effects tests proved too costly or unpredictable. A handful of the larger explosions originally planned as centerpiece moments were trimmed, softened, or replaced with alternate shots. The crew improvised, frequently adjusting choreography and camera placement to stay within the shrinking envelope of time and budget. On the surface, audiences received a straightforward rescue and pursuit narrative, moving briskly between military bases, cityscapes, and armored convoys. It was the kind of film designed to feel smooth, controlled, and confidently assembled. Yet the hidden truth lies in how much of that control came from the edit rather than the shoot. To maintain a consistent tone and to keep Sheen's on-screen persona aligned with the studio's expectations, entire scenes were reshaped. Some were restructured to reduce emotional volatility. Others were trimmed to soften moments that risked overshadowing the film's intended pacing. Even the score was reportedly adjusted late in post-production to smooth over transitions between sequences that originally belonged to different versions of the script. The result is a film that presents a unified face, but one built from pieces that didn't always belong together. Every polished frame hints at an earlier, rougher form, a version shaped by experiment fatigue and compromise before it was quietly replaced. What survived wasn't merely an action story. It was a portrait of how far a studio would go to keep its leading man anchored, even as everything around him shifted. Bonus fact: The Last Patrol 2000. Some films arrived too late for the era they were meant to belong to, and others never truly arrive at all. The Last Patrol lived somewhere in between, shot in the dying echo of the 90s action boom, assembled from the remains of a shrinking market and released with such little ceremony that for years it felt like a movie misplaced rather than distributed. But behind its quiet release lies a story that mirrors every struggle of its decade: dwindling budgets, lost footage, and a production forced to reinvent itself at every turn simply to survive. Originally conceived as a more ambitious post-apocalyptic thriller, the film faced mounting constraints almost from the moment cameras rolled. Locations approved early in development were scaled back after cost projections came in too high. Exterior sequences meant to showcase vast desert landscapes were rewritten when equipment issues delayed key shooting days. Even the ensemble cast, built to give the story weight and energy, had to adjust to a schedule that shifted unpredictably, leaving whole scenes to be reconfigured on the spot. On-screen viewers encountered a sparse, almost surreal narrative: survivors in a fractured world, storms sweeping through barren terrain, and characters searching for purpose in a nowhere landscape. But beneath that minimalist tone lay the traces of what had been action beats that were once written as major set pieces, cut down to brief confrontations, long tracking shots reduced to handheld fragments and sequences, meant to define the world quietly removed when the production could no longer support them. Some early cuts reportedly ran far longer, hinting at a broader mythology, but those versions were lost or overwritten as distributors requested a film that could move quickly and sell cleanly in international markets. The final version feels like a transmission from a fading industry, its ambition filtered through compromise, its tone shaped by necessity more than vision. It is a reminder that not every film is allowed to fail loudly. Some are reshaped, reduced, and quietly released into the world with only fragments of their original identity intact. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. In the dim glow of an editing room, truth becomes a negotiator. These 5 films, each forged in chaos, scarcity, or secrecy, show how action cinema often reveals more behind the curtain than it ever does on the screen. Strike Commando 2 fought against the limits of time, shaping itself from recycled frames and endurance. Delta Force 3 was built in the final hours of a dying studio, assembled from fragments of ambition slipping through collapsing walls. Eye of the Eagle blurred the line between performance and danger, created in places where history still breathed through the trees. American Samurai split into 2 identities, its true form hidden inside an edit most audiences never saw. And The Peacekeeper, polished yet uneasy, carried the quiet weight of a production reshaped to maintain the image of its leading man. Together they show a pattern buried beneath the explosions and chase scenes, a world where every decision is shaped by fatigue, fear, risk, or the hope that a salvaged moment might still tell a story. When the cuts pile up and the footage strains under pressure, movies stop being entertainment and become artifacts of survival. They are reminders that filmmaking is rarely clean and almost never honest. What we watch is only the last, most acceptable version of what once existed. The rest remains in cans, in memories, or in versions never meant to be seen. So now the question turns to you. Which truth do you believe, the one preserved on the screen, or the ones buried in the edits that never reached you? What versions of these films do you wish still existed, and what would you risk to see them? Real secrets where the truth was always in the edit.